interesting conversations back and forth. And so here we go, we're live. So hi everyone, I want to thank you. My name is Bronwyn for being here. My name is Bronwyn Jones. I am an editor at Kosovo 2.0. And today we're going to be talking to Mona Eltahawy, who is a feminist icon. And we can say this without any sort of how do you say, call it, modification, because that's what she is. And she's here to talk to us today about how to fight the patriarchy. And I know all of you will be really excited to jump in. So I've talked to Mona a little bit before, and we've decided to just go for it and jump in with the questions. She's written 2 fantastic books, Headscarves and Hymens and The 7 Sins for Girls. And she's going to be able to talk about all of that and also give us tips, give us ideas about how to fight the patriarchy. And we encourage you to jump in with your questions. You can just send them onto the chat. My colleagues on Facebook and on YouTube will put the questions here, and I will read them to her, and she will get right back to you. And if you have any comments, answers, that would be great too. So Mona, my first question, I'm so excited to be here. My first question to you is, your last book dealt a lot with civility and how women in the world right now are often sort of punished by the idea of civility. Like, you know, you can't say this, or you can't use those words, or that's too profane, or that takes away from your argument. And you're like, no, we should just go for it, straight up the middle. Let's just say what we have to say and say it directly to power. And recently, not too long ago, you were actually really got a lot of complaints for saying a comment on Australian television. And maybe you want to talk a little bit about that and why you feel that we really need to, as women, we really need to just go straight and talk to power in the most, if possible, and sometimes in the most profane way, if necessary.
Thank you for the introduction, Bronwyn. And hello, everyone. Welcome to everyone who's watching now. My name is Mona Eltahawy. My pronouns are she, her, and I begin everything, everywhere I speak with fuck the patriarchy. So it's a perfect beginning to answer your question, Bronwyn. And I begin everything I do. And I often say also as well that my declaration of faith is fuck the patriarchy. And I insist on this. And I wrote a whole chapter on profanity. I call it one of the 7 necessary sins for women and girls. That's the title of my book. So one of the sins is profanity. And I'm very insistent on this. And I will tie in the Australian TV show very soon, because I want us to consider who has created these rules of decorum and politeness and civility, and who has decided what we can and what we can't say. And by and large, it's the patriarchy. And when I talk about patriarchy, I'm not talking about one man or kind of an ordinary man or your father or my brother. I'm talking about a system of oppressions. And I want people to imagine an octopus. And the head of that octopus is patriarchy. And each one of the 8 tentacles of the octopus is one of the oppressions that patriarchy uses to basically strangle us and keep us in place. And one of them, obviously, is misogyny, or the hatred of women, which plays out as sexism, which is discrimination based on sex. And then the others are things like capitalism, homophobia and transphobia, ableism, ageism, racism, white supremacy. So depending on where you live, those 8 tentacles will be working more than others. And in some places, they'll all be working together. And right now in the United States, they're all working together. White supremacy, misogyny, homophobia, under this fascist fuck called Donald Trump. So as part of all of that, one of the things that patriarchy uses against us is it insists that we fight those oppressions politely and with civility. And that's like asking me to fight with one of my hands behind my back. That's just not going to work, because I insist that everyone acknowledge that civility and decorum and politeness benefit those in power. So they would benefit the octopus. they would benefit a fascist fuck like Donald Trump, which is why I always call him a fascist fuck, because I insist that we break down those barriers to speaking honestly and telling power honestly, I see what you're doing. And one of the examples that I give in my chapter on profanity is an incredible feminist scholar from Uganda called Stella Nyanzi. And Stella Nyanzi has been in and out of prison in Uganda because she has insisted on using profane and vulgar language as a tool. Because in Uganda, Yoweri Museveni has been a dictator for more than 30 years. And Stella Nyanzi says, you know, you have all the guns and you have all the bullets and you have all the tanks, and all I have to fight back with are my words and my body. Because sometimes she also protests topless or semi-nude, like the picture here behind me, the painting behind me. And what Stella Nyanzi is doing is, and like I said, this has landed her in prison, and she actually was convicted. She was put on trial and convicted and charged or on the charge of offending Museveni, the dictator of her country. And she spent 18 months in prison for using vulgar, profane language. And what Stella Nyanzi is doing, and what I insist we all do, is she's using something called radical rudeness. A scholar of Ugandan history has called it radical rudeness. And this is a reminder of why it's important to speak profanely and using vulgar language against the power. Because this was something that was used in Uganda under British colonization, when the British were there. So you had these very, very Christian, very white, very conservative men who were the colonizers in Uganda, who insisted that the independence movement in Uganda be polite, observe decorum, all this other nonsense. And so, of course, the independence fighters in Uganda said, fuck you, we're not going to be polite. We're fighting for our independence here. So I like to remind people that this is a historically valid way of fighting back. And I call my profane language, when I say Donald Trump is a fascist fuck, and when I say fuck the patriarchy, that is the verbal equivalent of civil disobedience. Because sometimes the laws are unjust and we have to break the law by going out there and being civilly disobedient. And my language is the verbal equivalent of that. Now, when I did that on Australian TV, I was on Australian TV in November of 2019. I said fuck 10 times, they actually counted. And one of the audience members, it was one of these shows where the audience asks questions. And one of them asked me, so throughout the show, I was saying fuck liberally. And I was warned by the host, but I didn't give a fuck. And one of the audience members asked me a question about another chapter in my book and another one of the sins on violence, and why I believe it's our right to fight back against patriarchy using everything, including violence, for self-defense and to fight for our independence from patriarchy. So what I did was something that I do in my book, and I asked a question. So this was a hypothetical. I said, how long must we wait for men and boys to stop beating and murdering us, and for rapists to stop raping us? How many rapists must we kill before men stop raping us? For this, and there were a few other reasons, but it was mostly the asking this hypothetical question. The network that broadcasts this TV show has banned this TV show. You can't watch this TV show anymore. Usually you can watch it on repeat, but they have censored it. Australia is a democracy, and in a democracy, a TV show was banned because a woman of color was on TV saying, all of you men, fuck you. And she asked a hypothetical question. And what really, really pisses me off is that my imaginary violence against rapists and my imaginary violence against men who murder us is considered more dangerous than the daily violence that women and girls and queer people are subjected to. So that's why I say fuck the patriarchy, and I insist that civility only holds up the power. Civility only benefits the racist. Civility only benefits the misogynist and the patriarchal. And I say fuck the racist and fuck the misogynist.
That's pretty clear. And I love very much. No, I really do. I love that very much because I think it's really important that we do sort of state our issues as women in very clear terms. And one of the things I notice what you do is when you talk about your imaginary violence in your statement, is what you're actually doing is bringing the argument to its most logical furthest point to make your point. And I see that a lot of women sort of hold back on that because we're trained not to speak that openly in that way.
Yes, yes. That's exactly what civility does. That's what decorum does. It basically is a structure that the powers that be, that octopus has created this structure for us to be confined by. And I refuse to be confined anymore. You know, we're all socialized in this. And one of the ways that I understood how difficult it was to do this was when I began to fight back against sexual violence, when I began to fight back against being touched and groped and assaulted in public against my will. And, you know, this has happened to women and girls all over the world. So this has happened to me in the US, this happened to me in Canada, it's happened to me in Egypt, it's happened to me during pilgrimage, Hajj, which is the 5th pillar of Islam. And Mecca in Saudi Arabia is the holiest site for Muslims. And I was sexually assaulted twice when I was 15 years old, 15, and performing pilgrimage with my family. And back then, when I was 15 years old, Bronwyn, I did not have the ability to fight back because girls are not taught to fight back. We're taught to be nice, we're taught to be quiet, we're taught to be polite. But how are we supposed to survive this world when all this niceness and politeness has gotten us nothing? You know, and we're assaulted and we're beaten. And especially during these days of the pandemic, when for a long, long time, the world has ignored another pandemic, which is violence against women, girls, children generally, and queer people. And now that so many of us are in lockdown and we're at home, we are stuck with our abusers. And after being socialized for so long to never fight back, can you imagine the horror of being basically imprisoned at home with your abuser? So when I began to fight back, you know, in the street, taking public transport, I understood how difficult it was to even just yell at a man, let alone shove him. So I began by yelling, and then I would shove, and then I would spit, and then I would smack. And then this all came to a head 2 years ago. It was actually when I was in the middle of writing the book, when I was sexually assaulted in a club in Montreal, Canada, and then I beat the fuck out of the man. So I consider that like the kind of like the crowning glory of my feminist journey, because I was done. I was like, fuck this shit. So I actually found the man and I beat him up. Now I say all of this by way of showing just how long it took me to get to that stage to do that. But there are two important points here. One is that after I beat this man up, one of the club managers came up to me and asked what happened. And I explained. And he actually said to me, he looked at my partner who was with me, my beloved, he pointed at him and he said to me, why didn't you let your husband take care of this? And I said to him, first of all, he's not my husband. And second of all, this is my body. I take care of it. But look what's happening here. This ties in with profanity and vulgarity and also taking the argument to its logical conclusion. He wants my male partner, Patriarchy, to defend me against the man who sexually assaulted me, Patriarchy. So he's basically telling me Patriarchy has to speak to Patriarchy over who owns your body. And I'm like, fuck you, no, because I don't want my partner to fight for me. I don't want anyone to protect me. I don't want protection. I want to be free. I want to be free of patriarchal violence. So of course I said to him, when I said this to him, he looked at me as if I were insane, you know? Mm-hmm. But when I talked about this on social media, because I began a hashtag I beat my assaulter. And I beat this man up 5 days after I began another hashtag, which was Mosque Me Too, which was about being assaulted during pilgrimage in Mecca. And that was for Muslim women to speak about being assaulted in a mosque or in pilgrimage at Mecca. And over those 5 days, the discourse from men changed incredibly. Because when I talked about being assaulted during pilgrimage and I began hashtag Mosque Me Too, all these men lined up and said to me, oh, you didn't do anything when this man or two men assaulted you in Mecca during pilgrimage. Why didn't you fight back? Why didn't you yell? Why didn't you do something about it? And then 5 days later, when I did something about it and I beat up this man who sexually assaulted me, and I started hashtag I beat my assaulter, guess what the men were saying now? They were saying, don't you think you overreacted? Don't you think that's too much? So you can't fucking win. So when you don't fight back, because you're socialized not to fight back, they ask, why didn't you fight back? And then finally, after years of pushing yourself to break these social codes and you can fight back, they say to you, this is too much, you overreacted. So you can't win with patriarchy. But we have to understand that in the United States, 2/3 of women, incarcerated women in the United States, are women of color, and most of them are there because they fought back against patriarchal violence. So there is a big price to pay, and I recognize that. And this is why I say that begin verbally, because that's the verbal civil disobedience, and let patriarchy know that we will fight back.
And I want to talk to you a little bit about your journey also to come to this place, because you were born in Egypt. You lived in Saudi Arabia for a while. You always say that you became feminist in Saudi Arabia. And then you, as I understand it, you wore the hijab for a while as well. And, you know, you use your body very often as part of your activism. When during the Egyptian Revolution, they broke your arms, the police broke your arms, and they sexually assaulted you, and you got tattoos on your arms where they broke them. And you know, you dyed your hair red for a long time. It was a flaming red hair you had, and now you've shaved your head. And this is part of your way of speaking to people, is through your own body. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Yes. So I did become a feminist when we moved to Saudi Arabia. Like you said, I was born in Egypt. And when I was 7, my family moved to London, and we lived in the UK for almost 8 years. And then my parents got jobs. We had to leave for various reasons. We wanted to stay in the UK, but at the time it didn't work out. So we moved because of Margaret Thatcher's visa policies, by the way, because my mother was supporting the family and my father was a stay-at-home dad. And we were very happy with that setup. But because of racist and misogynist visa and immigration policies in the UK, the father was considered the head of the household, and they would not renew my father's residency in the UK because he was not working outside of the home and my mum was. So my parents both found jobs in Saudi Arabia, and we moved to Saudi Arabia when I was 15. And I write openly in my first book, and I've said, a million times, moving to Saudi Arabia traumatized me into feminism. Because I come from a Muslim family. I come from a country that is majority Muslim. But moving to Saudi Arabia was like my world turned upside down. This was another level of misogyny. I had nothing prepared me for Saudi Arabia in 1982, nothing. And it was incredible reverse culture shock. It wasn't the kind of Islam that I was used to. Women and girls in Saudi Arabia in 1982, and I'm guessing it hasn't changed in many parts of that country to now, are considered the walking embodiment of sin. And it was a massive shock to my system. And I became a feminist before I even discovered the word. So we moved there when I was 15. I could immediately feel it. And I discovered the word feminism, ironically enough, in my university library in Saudi Arabia, because I began my university studies in Saudi Arabia. And I found a shelf full of feminist journals and books. I don't know who put it there, some subversive professor, thank you, which gave me the word feminism. But it was during that time in Saudi Arabia when I did begin to wear the hijab. And when I look back now at why I wore the hijab, it's clear to me that I wore the hijab to hide. Now, my mother wears hijab, my sister wears hijab, and my sister-in-law wears hijab. And I recognize that for many Muslim women, it can be a positive experience. That was not my experience. My experience with hijab was not positive. I began to wear hijab because I wanted to hide. And when I speak with non-Muslim friends about this wanting to hide at the age of 15 or 16, it's very similar to their experience of being a teenage girl in the US who was sexually assaulted, who wanted to hide by wearing loose clothes and just did not want male attention of any kind. And that's why I began to wear hijab. I just did not, I was tired of being groped and sexually assaulted, because I began to wear hijab soon after pilgrimage, when I was sexually assaulted twice. Very soon after I began to wear hijab, I realized it was not for me. And I wanted to take it off, but there's such a taboo over taking off the hijab. And when people talk about choice, and I know that my mother has chosen to wear it, and so was my sister and my sister-in-law, but from my own experience, choosing to wear the hijab is much easier than choosing to take it off. And this is why I often ask people to complicate the word choice, because 1 year after beginning to wear it, I wanted to take it off, but it was, my family fought me, society fought me. It was so difficult to take it off. It took me 8 years to finally have the strength and courage to take off my hijab. So I wore it from the age of 16 to 25. And then, you know, I had moved back to Egypt when I took it off. And I'm gonna fast forward to, so I became a journalist in Egypt. I worked with Reuters news agency in Egypt. I moved to Jerusalem with Reuters, where I covered the Palestinian beat. I would go to the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and I wrote about Palestinians who lived within what is called Israel. So they were Palestinians who had Israeli citizenship, but I also went to the occupied territories. I went to the West Bank, I went to Gaza. And then I moved back to Egypt after Jerusalem. And then I moved to the US exactly 20 years ago. This month marks my 20th anniversary in the United States. And to get to Egypt and the revolution in my body, I'm gonna fast forward over the US. We can talk about it later if you want. I married a man, I left the man, he doesn't matter. He's a blip in my life story. But the revolution in Egypt was the highlight of my life. I mean, so many Egyptians were waiting for that moment. When I moved back to Egypt in 1988, after 14 years away, I was 21 years old. And every day I would be going to university and I would be asking my aunts and uncles, where is the revolution? Because there's so much poverty in Egypt. There's so much injustice in Egypt. The systematic and systemic oppression by the military-backed regime, the torture, the imprisonment for political views, just so much injustice. So back in 1988, I was like, where's the revolution? So many of us, where's the revolution? So when the revolution came in 2011, it was the highlight of our lives. Now, in this year marks the 10th anniversary of the beginning of what is called the Arab Spring, because Tunisia was the first country to have a revolution. When Egypt had the revolution, those 18 days in January of 2011, I wasn't in Egypt, I was in New York. But I went back to Egypt twice after that in 2011, and that's the point where, as you mentioned, Egyptian riot police broke my arms and sexually assaulted me. Now, as a writer, to have your arms in a cast, both your arms, and you can't write like this, I felt like the primary way that I communicate with the world was ended. I felt like, I mean, I was, you know, during that time disabled in the sense that I couldn't use my 10 fingers. So that's when I really also began to think of my body as a canvas that was going to convey a message for me. And so I promised myself that when my bones healed, not when my heart healed, because my heart is still healing, but when my bones healed, I would dye my hair bright red, because that was my way of saying, fuck you, I survived, you didn't kill me. And I would get tattoos on both my arms, because when the cast came off, I wanted a mark on my arm of my own choosing, because I have a scar from what they did to me. And I'm proud of the scar, but I wanted a permanent mark of my own choosing. So on my right forearm, I have the ancient Egyptian goddess Sekhmet. She's the goddess of retribution and sex. And I say, yes, please to both. And on my left arm, I have the Arabic calligraphy for the name of the street where we had this iconic protest where I was assaulted, and under it in big letters, bigger than the name of the street, the Arabic word for freedom, Hurriya, because we were liberated on that street. So that's when I really began to think of my body as a canvas. My bright red hair, the tattoos, I've had more tattoos since then, including the Black bisexual poet June Jordan and her very famous words, "We are the ones we have been waiting for." And so that's when my body really began to be, you know, much more than when I was wearing hijab, because hijab I didn't really feel represented me. But then this, you know, because when the pandemic began, I did not know, I'm not a scientist. I'm a writer. My words, my body, all of this. And I was like, okay, maybe 2 months and then we'll all be back to normal, huh? There is no normal. Normal has been fucked. Normal is gone. So when I understood that we really have to adjust to a new world, because none of us has experienced anything like this pandemic before, I began to think more and more about the world that I want. And the world that I want is a world that says, fuck normal. Because the normal that we had before the pandemic is that octopus with the tentacles of the oppressions. Because in the United States, and I'm sure this replicates across the world, this pandemic has disproportionately affected Black Americans, Americans of color, indigenous people, the senior citizens, the poor, the disabled, basically all the people who are hurt the most by this octopus. This is who normal is hurt the most by. So I don't want this normal anymore. Fuck normal. So my way of saying fuck normal was to cut off all of my hair. Because every time I look in the mirror, I want to remember that the world that we are leaving behind is gone. And we now have to start planning for the world that we're moving to. So this is my way of saying, fuck normal. Let's start planning and let's fight for a better world.
So I just want to remind everyone that please send in your questions. And we have our first question. It's from Valbona Mustafa. And she asks, have you ever been called crazy or a mental case by men for standing up to them? It happens to me often.
All the time. Thank you for your question. Yes, all the time. I mean, I was talking with you, Bronwyn, before we began that in Egypt today, young feminists are launching a hashtag, which is the beginning, or it actually translates into, in Arabic, it's Bidayat al-Thawra al-Nasawiyya, which in English is the feminist revolution begins. And this is because over the past 2 weeks now, maybe 10 days less, dozens of women have been speaking out and sharing their experience of being sexually assaulted, of being raped, of sexual harassment. And this all followed, it's been described as Egypt's Me Too moment, because it began when a group of young women outed a serial rapist. And when that began, so many others heard what they said and they went on social media and began to share their stories. So it's incredible to watch this. And many of them have reached out to me and said, will you contribute? Will you please tell the rest of the world what's happening? I've made videos in support, to encourage, to say, this is fantastic, this is incredible. And every time I post a video, I usually, on social media, I speak in English, but I've been posting videos in Arabic, specifically to address my feminist sisters in Egypt and feminist comrades. Every time I post a video in Arabic, some man, like 2 seconds later, you're crazy. Look at you. Are you a man or a woman? Look at the painting behind you. You're crazy. Who wants to listen to you? All the time. And the way that I respond, whether it's a man in Egypt or in the US, the way I respond, or Australia after the TV show, is I say to them this: to be called insane by a misogynist shit like you is an honor. It is an honor to be called insane. Because if I have it, to get your approval means to be sane, I don't want that sanity. I am glad to be insane. So I take all of these insults that these misogynist shits throw at me and I just turn them right round. I'm like, fuck you. It's an honor to be called insane.
So just before we go on again, I just want to say, and thank you again for your question, Valbona. I want to thank the Kosovo Civil Society Foundation for supporting this talk and for the masterclass. But I want to ask you something about what you mentioned before, which I thought was a great metaphor, this octopus with the patriarchy as the head and the tentacles of racism, transphobia, sexism. How do we, we're women, we're trying to be in the movement, we're trying to fight for our rights, but often I've found, especially, and I'm from the US, you find that the majority women tend to have the voice in the movement, and you tend to sort of block out the voices from minority women, particularly in the US, the example is usually the white middle class second wave of feminism. here in Kosovo, I wonder, how do we as women make sure that we're bringing in voices from minority communities? Because this has started, but I don't know if this is really, how do we even push that even more?
Right. Well, it's such an important question, Bronwyn, and it's something that we continually have to fight to ensure. Because, here in the United States, of course, I'm sure you're all following it in Kosovo, there is a Black-led revolution. The Black Lives Matter movement is a revolution now, where it has spread across every state in the country. There have been protests everywhere. And the protests, began after the murder of George Floyd by a police officer, which was horrifically captured on film and, has been broadcast so many times. But it's bigger than that. It's not just about the murder of this one man. It's about systemic racism, systemic anti-Blackness, police brutality, and also the exclusion of so many people and so many voices. And that question you asked me fits into that. And what I hope the rest of the world takes from this revolution in the United States, because right now in the United States, all of those voices who have traditionally, because of this octopus, been excluded, and I say traditionally because we all operate under that structure of the octopus, which is considered normal. That's why I say fuck normal. We have to slay this octopus in order to move beyond that tradition and the way things are and normal. So what's happening in the United States is that trans women are speaking, Black trans women are saying, we are here too. And Black women are reminding everyone that if you don't listen to Black women, you are not listening to the person, basically. And this is where especially Black trans women are at the intersection of this. If you could imagine a person who is most strangled by all of those tentacles of the patriarchy, it would be a Black trans woman, because all of those oppressions would be in operation on her body. So this moment is a good teachable one for the rest of the world, in that it has to make us stop and ask, who are the people that we do not see and we do not hear from? Because we often hear this phrase, giving a voice to the voiceless, and we really must stop saying that, because nobody is voiceless. Everybody has a voice, but we don't hear it. So we have to ask why. And if we don't hear it, it's because they're being silenced, or they're not being given a platform, or someone is speaking over them. So always look for the voices that you can't hear, because they are speaking, but you can't hear them. Because nobody will be free unless the person who is most strangled by that octopus is free. Because if I now, as an so I'm not a white woman, I'm a woman of color, but I'm able-bodied, I'm cisgender, I have access to so much right here. The fact that we're speaking like this means that I have a platform. So I have so many privileges working to my advantage. So I'm up here considering, in my ability to fight the octopus, but I am not the standard by which to measure. So it's not enough for me to say, I'm okay now, I've achieved everything I want, feminism has succeeded. That's not feminism. Feminism is not the elevation of individual or exceptional women to positions of power, and then we sit back and we celebrate and congratulate ourselves. Feminism is the destruction of patriarchy. So feminism is the destruction of that octopus, because I might be elevated and considered a success story, but who have I left behind? So I refuse to play this game where I'm going to get up here and consider feminism, consider this a post-feminist world. We're not post anything. We're not post-racist. We're not post-feminist. We're not post anything. So in Kosovo, as everywhere, I would urge everyone to look for the people who are most strangled by those tentacles and to amplify their voices and to go there and ask them what they need in order to be heard. Not what can I say for you? You're not going to speak for them. How can you amplify their voices? What do they need in order to be free of the tentacles of the octopus, and recognize that you are only as free as the most oppressed person in whatever society you live in.
Okay, so we have another question. It's from Victoria Ruzzi, and she says, what do you think should be the role of cis straight men in feminism be? Or better said, should they even have one? Doesn't it go somewhere in the direction of patriarchy, fighting patriarchy, as you put it?
Right. I have been known to say, fuck cishet men. I am done with cishet men because I'm so angry at so much of their silence and at so much of their ability and their willingness to say, for example, I have never raped anyone. I have never beaten anyone. I don't know why you're so angry at me. And I always remind them, patriarchy is not about you and not about your individual grace and good behavior. Good for you. What do you want, a fucking cookie because you've never raped anyone? Come on, that's not the standard. So I always say, and this is something that we can take to other forms of oppression too, because often white people will say, well, I'm not racist. You know, so whether you're a white person saying, I'm not racist, or you're a cisgender heterosexual man saying, well, I'm not a misogynist and I don't rape anyone, understand that that octopus benefits you. Even if you are not yourself violent, and even if you think you are not yourself a misogynist or a sexist or a rapist or a white supremacist or a racist, what you are is someone who benefits from this system. And the way that this system works right now is it benefits the most the white, cisgender, heterosexual, wealthy, orthodox man. Orthodox in that following the rules, not orthodox religion. And so depending on where you are in the United States, it would be a man who looks like Donald Trump, a fascist fuck. So you would be white, able-bodied, cisgendered, heterosexual, conservative in your political attitudes, and wealthy. So even if you're not that, the system will benefit you. So unless you're actively fighting the octopus, you are not an ally to feminism. Unless you're actively fighting white supremacy, you are not an ally to people of color. I'm guessing that in Kosovo, as in other countries in the region, the Roma people are subjected to a lot of discrimination, right? So even if you yourself, not you, Bronwyn, but someone watching, even if whoever's watching is not someone who indulges in anti-Roma discrimination, unless you are actively fighting the discrimination and the oppression of the Roma people, you are benefiting from a system that is set up to put them down here and put you up there. So it's not enough to just sit and say, I don't do all this terrible stuff, I'm okay. No, you're not okay, because you have to fight to dismantle that system. So if a cishet man does not want me to say, fuck cishet men, go out there and fight the system that elevates the cishet man. And then maybe I'll allow you to be my ally.
Yeah, there's a great phrase right now coming from the Black Lives Matter movement. It's not enough to be anti-racist, you must fight racism. And so, and on that note, we have a couple more questions. So I'm going to start off with Granada. Leshy, as schools should be environments that foster open-mindedness and critical thinking, among others, what are some tangible actions that can be taken to mainstream addressing patriarchy, but also other much needed topics into the school culture?
Right. Well, you know, something that recently I came across that pleased me greatly, and I think that it gives a lot of us kind of ideas of what to do, is that Scotland, this tiny country, Scotland, it's been progressive in a lot of its policies recently. So a few months ago, just before the pandemic, actually, it was the first country in the world that made menstrual products available for free for everyone who menstruates. And by everyone who menstruates, I mean cis women and girls, non-binary people, and trans men, everyone who menstruates. So Scotland, you know, has been at kind of like the pioneering vanguard of so much. And more recently, Scotland has said, and by saying this, it's going to become the first country that will introduce LGBTQ issues in its sex education classes. And that's so important. So it's so important to remember that when we step into the classroom, and this is something that I deal with when it comes to racism, for example, in US classrooms, in my book, The 7 Necessary Sins, when a teacher and the students step into a classroom, that octopus that I talk about is not left outside of the classroom waiting for everyone to resume normal life. That octopus goes into the classroom and sits there. It's inside the teacher, and it's sitting there inside and next to all the students. So the same things that we fight outside of the classroom, we must fight inside. We must constantly be aware of the way that children are socialized by this octopus. I always tell people that the revolution is not just against the president. The revolution is not just against the state, because yes, the state oppresses us all, but the street and the home work with the state in what I call the trifecta of misogyny. That triangle of misogyny, they work together. And by the street, I mean public space and, you know, being outside in public space. And by the home, I mean the family. And the state, the street, and the home are all subject to patriarchal power. The patriarchal family is the reason that this pandemic of intimate partner terrorism or intimate partner violence and domestic abuse is ignored. And now we're seeing 30% increases at home because people are in lockdown during the pandemic. That's because the patriarchal family structure socializes us into believing the father is the head of the household and parents own their children, because mothers abuse as well as fathers. Parents don't own their children. Nobody owns children. But that's what the patriarchy family structure does. And that same thinking goes into school. And so school becomes a form of indoctrination in this patriarchal thinking. And what we need are feminist teachers. We need feminist curricula. We need a curriculum that is going to destroy the patriarchy, that is going to destroy the octopus by fighting racism, by fighting capitalism, by fighting misogyny, by fighting homophobia and transphobia. This is what we need. And so I want people to remember that octopus walking into the classroom, and how we have to ask ourselves, how can we fight the octopus inside and outside the classroom?
Okay, and we've got one more question. I think you'll find this very interesting. It's from Balbona Mustafa again. We have boy or abortion phenomenon happening here. She means gender selective abortion, I believe, in Kosovo, even by some well-educated women. How can we fight this amongst us women and society in general?
Right. I often get that question in countries where this is a phenomenon, like India, for example. This is a phenomenon, and so I'm very distressed to hear that that is something that is happening in Kosovo. This obviously is a result of patriarchy. This obviously is a result of the way that boys are favored across the world because of, you know, let me rewind a bit. I often hear from people, so I'm an anarchist feminist, and I came to anarchism through feminism. And I often hear from my socialist and communist friends or comrades that, no, we have to fight the class structure first. And once we fight the class structure, everything is going to be solved. And I utterly disagree with this, because there are countries that are fighting classism and they still have racism and they still have misogyny. So I refuse this argument completely. I'm fighting the octopus, and it's always about race, class, and gender. And within race, class, and gender, within that trifecta, all the problems lie. So I'm not just going to take class and just focus on it. I'm going to focus on all of them at once. And this, I think, is what we have to remember when we talk about sex selective abortion. The fact that boys are favored, the fact that men are favored, the fact that families understand, even subliminally, that every society in the world favors men and boys. And the reason that I say that I fight race, class, and gender and the octopus that represents patriarchy is that regardless of where you live, whether you live in a country in Central or Eastern Europe, or you live in China, or you live in the United States or Saudi Arabia, regardless of whether you have a monarchy in power or an elected government in power, or you live under communist dictatorship and the Chinese Communist Party, patriarchy is the true power, regardless of all the other structures. So this is why sex selective abortion happens, because women and girls are discriminated against, so much so that even in the womb, we are discriminated against. Now, some conservative groups who don't believe in feminism at all use this as an excuse to try to restrict access to abortion. And they will try to use feminist arguments by saying, oh, but you see, they use abortion to selectively abort female fetuses. And I urge everyone to reject this argument. This is disingenuous and it's not sincere, because these conservative groups are aiming to abolish our right to access abortion altogether. The way to fight sex selective abortion is not by banning abortion or criminalizing abortion. The way to fight it is by fighting patriarchy, is by fighting our societies that elevate boys and men to above women, girls, non-binary people, and transgender communities generally. So it's terrible, it's very distressing, but I urge everyone not to fall into the temptation of the conservative groups which try to fight it by restricting abortion. Let's keep abortion free, legal, and easy to access, and safe. And let's fight patriarchy. Those two things can coexist.
Okay, so I have a question for you about nationalism and religion in that sense. And you've talked a little bit about religion. And I want to talk to you about, one thing I noticed when we talk about feminism, it's more than just the dictionary definition, fighting for the rights of women. It's about so much more, and it covers so much more. It really is a way of thinking, a way of thought about the entire world, which helps everyone, not just women, as a matter of fact. And I want to ask you about this in the concept of nationalism, which is a big issue here in the Balkans, particularly, and around the world. Let's face it. Let's not just say it's just here; it's everywhere, as you well know. And how do you, when you're you want to be a feminist, you want to be this open-minded kind of thing. How do you deal with issues, thought like nationalism?
I know that this is a very loaded subject, especially in the Balkans and especially for Kosovo, because of independence, because of the importance of having an independent state, considering the history of the region and of Kosovo especially. And I come to this as an anarchist feminist. And like you said, for me, feminism is a philosophy, a movement, an ideology, all of this. It's much, much bigger than saying, I want equal rights for women. I mean, I often say, I want something much bigger than equality. I want freedom. Why would I want to be equal to a man when a man is not free? Now, when we look at who is the head, who is the most powerful person when it comes to the octopus, it's this usually, so in the United States, it would be a white, able-bodied, wealthy, Christian, cis-het man, all of this cisgendered heterosexual man. But unless you're like that 1%, the billionaires in the United States, you're not free. Men are not free. I urge men to remember that they are not free, because if you're a man of color or if you're a black man, you're not free of racism. If you're a disabled man, you're not free of ableism. If you're an old man, you're not free of ageism. If you're a man who's gay, if you're a man who's bi, if you're a man who's trans, you're not free of so many things. So when we really examine patriarchy, we will see that so many of us are not free. So it's not enough for me to say, I want equality. I want something much bigger. I want to be free. And under that freedom, or because of that freedom, I also want to be free of borders, because I think that as much as I know that people in Kosovo are celebrating independence and anniversaries and all of this, I also urge everyone across the world, especially in the United States, when I remember, and I urge people to remember, that we have families on the border between the United States and Mexico in cages. We have families that have been separated, where their children have been stolen from families and given up for adoption. And these are families that came to the United States seeking asylum and seeking shelter from places where there are wars or extreme levels of violence. And there are refugees who die on the Mediterranean Sea every day, trying to get to countries where they just want to live safely with their families, because they're fleeing either economic oppression or the oppression of war or of violence. So for me, my position as an anarchist feminist, when it comes to nationalism and countries generally, I want to abolish borders everywhere. Part of my anarchist feminism is an opposition to this idea of the state, because this idea of the state is a patriarchal structure. Borders are patriarchal in the same way that a family is patriarchal. When we think of the state, and I think of that trifecta of misogyny, the state, the street, and the home, that patriarchal family structure is a microcosm of the patriarchal family, which is the state. The president is often called the father of the nation, yeah? And the first lady is often called the mother of the nation. That's the macro family, and the family at home is the micro family. And I want to abolish all of this, because that's where the patriarchal structures live. And for me, part of that is borders and nationalism. I don't want anyone to die crossing the Mediterranean, hoping to go to a better life. And by this, I mean whether they want a better life economically or a life outside of a war zone. I don't care. I believe as human beings, we should be free to live anywhere we want, wherever we want. Most people want to stay right where they are because that's where their loved ones are. But it should be our right as human beings to live everywhere we want. And part of that, now someone asked me earlier, do you often get called crazy? This is when I get called crazy, when I talk about anarchism and abolishing the state and abolishing the borders and abolishing prisons. And people are like, okay, you're either a utopian idealist or you're just insane. So take your pick. I'm happy to be both. But I would love a world where we could all just move and live and be wherever we want to lead our lives to their freest and most best potential.
Okay, we have another question coming in, and here it is. Within feminist movements, we talk about solidarity among women. However, very often, there are voices that have difficulty showing solidarity towards women that still struggle with internalized and taught misogyny. Do you have any wisdom to share on how to feed this solidarity better? And that's from Ilariana Banska. She's a big feminist, yeah.
Thank you. I love these questions. These questions are great. Thank you, everyone who's asking these questions. I began to use a particular term over the past 3 or 4 years because historically, well, it's been decades now, the majority of white women voters in the United States vote for the Republican Party, which is a party that, for me, represents patriarchy with a big P. And this became an issue when Donald Trump was elected, and people were horrified to learn that the majority of white women voters voted for Donald Trump because they vote for the Republican Party. And many people began to ask, how could these women do this, knowing that Donald Trump has boasted about sexually assaulting women when he famously said during an interview that when you're famous, women let you grab them by the pussy. Basically, he was boasting about his ability, quote unquote, to sexually assault women. So people were horrified and said, how could women vote against their own interests? And for a while, I used to also say this, vote against their own interests. But many of my Black feminist friends and comrades and sisters made me see that that is the wrong thing to say. They weren't voting against their interests. They were actually voting for their interests because it was in their interest as white women to vote for the party that best represents white power and white interests, because they get that their adjacency to that power gives them power. So a white woman who votes for Donald Trump recognizes that Donald Trump will maintain the supremacy of white people in the United States. And this applies to women across the world, depending on where you are and what the situation is. Because yes, we've all internalized misogyny. We've all been socialized into misogyny. And some of us recognize that that misogyny inside is best left inside, because if we're quiet about it and we uphold the patriarchy wherever we are, that patriarchy rewards us. In the United States, it rewards white women with protection, quote unquote, with money, with power. And depending on where you are, it protects you with various things. Now, I call those things that patriarchy gives us as a reward when we uphold it, crumbs. And I don't want those crumbs. I want the entire cake. And in fact, I don't want patriarchy's cake. I want to make my own cake, even though I can't bake, but never mind, let's just pretend I can. So reject the crumbs, because what ends up happening is that scenario where patriarchy tells patriarchy to protect my body. When women continue to uphold patriarchy, and in return for the crumbs of patriarchy, whether it's your husband will provide for you, your husband will protect you, or the president will make sure that your interests are maintained, understand that protection is conditional. And that anytime you violate the terms of that agreement between you, you will be hurt. And so in Kosovo, I don't know what the negotiation would be, but if these are women who are privileged, who are upper class, who are wealthy, who are adjacent to power, if they don't recognize that their benefits could very, very easily be retracted, one of these days it will come and it will hurt. So always reject an alliance with patriarchy and understand that that alliance comes at a cost. I call all of those women, because I began by saying I've come up with a term for them, foot soldiers of the patriarchy, because they go out there and they fight on behalf of patriarchy. They police other women. They put down other women because they recognize that they will be rewarded by patriarchy because they are adjacent to power. And that is a very dangerous position to be in, because you're going to be on the front lines. And who gets killed first in a war? The foot soldiers, because they're the front line of the war. So reject being a foot soldier of the patriarchy is my message.
You also called them the bootlickers of the patriarchy as well.
When they get super extra fascist in their kowtowing to patriarchy, then they're bootlicking too. Yes, I mean, like, I throw them out depending on just how badly they reject the realization that they are foot soldiers. If they are super especially bad foot soldiers, they're bootlicking.
I think though, do you feel that sometimes, like, certain women, when I mean, all of us internalize misogyny, as you said.
Yeah.
And when certain women sort of make that compromise with misogyny, they're really just doing it also for their own comfort, of course. We know this, right? So I'm wondering, is it sometimes, and they're also sometimes doing it for their own survival, you know, having to marry someone, having to have not having the choice and having children, you know, having to do these performative family structures, this sort of thing. It's easier than fighting it. So how do we as feminists really help those women break out of those structures?
Right. No, you're absolutely right. And I'm so glad you brought that up, Bronwyn, because just yesterday I was having a whole long discussion with mostly women on my Twitter interactions about I'm child-free by choice. I've chosen not to have children, and I'm very happy with that choice. And I chose not to have children because I wanted to be free. And it's such a taboo for a woman to say, I do not want children, I want to be free. Because then you get into all kinds of arguments with women who have children who say, are you saying I'm not free? That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying I wanted to be free. But yes, in many cases, women who have children are not free because of the patriarchal family structure. But I also recognize when I say that it came with a lot of fighting on my behalf. It was not easy. So I recognize the fight that goes into it. I'm very lucky that my parents did not push me and pressure me. But I know I have relatives who were pressured by their families to be married and to have children. So I recognize the incredible amount of fighting that involves. And I do also recognize that for some women, it's simply not a choice. I make a distinction between women who willingly play foot soldier and willingly bootlick the patriarchy, and women who enter into these enforced patriarchal structures for survival. There's a difference, because the foot soldiers and the bootlickers, these white women who voted for Donald Trump, they didn't do it for survival. They did it for benefit and power. They did it because they're being next to power gives them power. And they refuse to acknowledge that by voting for Donald Trump, they hurt so many other women who do not have the benefit of their position, you know? I make a distinction between that and women who do not have that power and who, in order to survive, entered into those family structures. I know so many women in Egypt, for example, who did not have the economic independence or freedom to be able to live the way that I do. And I know that. And so, yes, they entered into a marriage because they had to. Yes, they have children because they had to. That the big difference between these two groups of women. So my message to the second group of women is, actually, my message is not to them. My message is to us. My message is to those of us who have the ability, the freedom, and the privilege to fight so hard that we create a space that is big enough for that second group of women to move into. Because they are fighting so many things. They're fighting the entire octopus. If I have managed in my own life, through my own struggle, to fight some of those tentacles, I am obliged to continue fighting all the other tentacles to create a greater space for those other women. Because when I think of, say, a working class woman who is fighting to get sick leave, right? Just so that when she is sick, or to get leave so that she can look after a parent or to look after a sick child, her situation in her family is going to be very different from mine, where I don't have children out of choice. And therefore, it is imperative for me to recognize that when I'm, for example, working in an office, which I'm not, I have to recognize that I have to fight extra hard to ensure that she gets all of those things that she needs as well, because her needs are going to be different than mine. So this is by way of saying these tentacles play out differently for everyone. But if you're actively helping the tentacles to suffocate a woman, and you're a woman who is suffocating from them, your position is very, very different. And my position as a feminist leader, a feminist pioneer, call me a feminist giant, as I call myself, is to make sure, thank you. My position, my role, my obligation is to make sure that I fight for the biggest space possible for all those women who write to me and say, you know, I love your books, I love what you say, but I'm not there yet. And I know that they just need some more support and more courage. So it's my job to create that space for them to walk out into it. And I do that by fighting patriarchy, which keeps them stuck in those structures that they enter to survive. No woman should enter into a marriage to survive. No woman should have children that she doesn't want to have in order to survive. Everyone should be able to do this freely in the way that I have chosen my life freely. And that's my job as a feminist, to ensure that freedom.
And I just want to tell you, people are sending hand claps on the chat, and they're getting comments asking, we're getting comments asking, how can we do a standing ovation online? Of course, standing ovation and applause now. So people, if you are at home and or in your office or wherever you are and you're watching this, you can stand up and clap and cheer and do as you like. We all hear you here, more or less. And Mona now hears you, so we all hear you. So keep sending those hand claps. Keep sending those questions in as well, because your questions are fantastic. As Mona will agree, but I'm gonna slip in. Oh, here we go. We got one. We got a couple here, but here it goes from Valbona Mustafa again. Please give us your blunt opinion on men who like to have a wife partner who has a career and a job, but not an opinion. I call them pimps. In big letters, pimp.
Oh, wow. Oh, so she can bring in the money, but she can't talk. Is that what it is?
Exactly, you know.
Wow.
This because you see this quite often everywhere. This is not just a Kosovo thing, where it's like, oh, it's great, my wife is a lawyer and a this, and by the way, she can go home and she can cook and she can clean and she can do this, but she doesn't have anything else to say. You know, sometimes you have these men who I say puppet the woke talk, and yeah, you know what I mean.
I totally know what you mean, and I love her term for it. Pimp works just fine. I call it fucking bullshit. Are you kidding me? No, it really is. You know, there's this group of men who like, I love independent women, I love strong women, and then for some bizarre reason, they like partner with a strong woman and then work their hardest to break her. It's like some kind of trophy or some kind of competition. I hear this from so many young women, that they are pursued by men who say to them, I love your independence. I love that you are so strong-minded. And then once those women agree to go out with them, those men just work their hardest to break down the very things that they claim they were attracted to. It's this bizarre form of sadistic, masochistic kind of, it's a very, very weird dynamic. And I think it's, you know, my octopus, I think next time I'm going to do a public talk, I'm going to have an octopus with me. I'm going to create an octopus kind of doll and say, it's because of this. It's because men are socialized everywhere you go, Kosovo, Egypt, the United States, into believing that you belong at the top. And this is what makes them think this way, in that, how can you, yes, I will let you. You know, sometimes I hear men say, of course I will let my wife work. What the fuck? Who asked your opinion anyway? What is this let business, you know? So this is all stuff that we are socialized. It depends on how you grew up at home, the dynamic that you saw between your parents. Again, it's this patriarchal family structure that continuously kind of pushes up And so what I want people to remember is that not all family structures are like that. There are family structures where there are two mothers, there are two fathers, there's a single parent, there's a communal family. There are gay parents I know who had the child via a surrogate. So I want us to consider all of these alternatives to the patriarchal family structure. And I look at them and I think that this really is our hope. I'm also queer, so I'm a queer anarchist feminist, because heteronormativity is the octopus. All of those things, it's like the borders. So I want to abolish the state, borders, patriarchy, heteronormativity. All of these normativities are what lead these men to think like this, because what they're basically doing is they're throwing a crumb to their wife or their partner and expecting her to celebrate this crumb. And that wife or partner should say, fuck you and fuck your crumbs. I'm making my own cake. And no, I will not be your dancing, performing puppet.
Okay, so here's our next question. And it's from Mirashahi Sula. And she says, from your book, The 7 Necessary Sins for Women and Girls, you talk about violence as a necessary sin. However, this seems to disturb people who oppose violence in all forms, people who actually refuse to even think of a world where women could be as violent towards men, just because. What do you say to those who refuse, what as men are to women today? I'm sorry, I read that wrong. I'm sorry, Mirashai. What do you say to those who refuse to even imagine, quote unquote, such a world where women declare war?
Thank you for that question, because the violence chapter is one of my favorites and is the one that always gets me into trouble. Because like I said, it got the TV episode banned in Australia. And you know, people's reaction to this chapter is really interesting. I was interviewed by a female journalist, and she actually said to me, a few other women have as well, but this was a real shock to my system. I have sons. How can you say this? How can you ask me to imagine violence against men? I have sons. And I was like, okay, I'm asking you to imagine a violence against your sons, but do you understand that the reality that parents of daughters every day face is actual violence rather than this imaginary violence that I'm asking the world to consider? I'm also asked, because this was the question that I was asked on Australian TV, doesn't violence beget violence? And when people ask me this question, they think that they're being a genius. But doesn't violence beget violence? And then I say to them, well, excuse me, I want you to answer me what centuries of patriarchal violence against women have begotten, you know? How am I supposed to respond to that? They seem to think that I invented violence and that violence began today with my saying it's my right to fight back. And they conveniently forget that there have been centuries of patriarchal violence against women, against children, against queer people. So my response to people who are saying, we don't want a violent world, we don't want to stoop to their level, we must rise above all of this, is for how long? For how long? You know, I ask in the chapter on violence in my book, those of you who keep saying we must not stoop to the level of violence that men embrace or that men enact on us, I ask, well, so we have to wait now for men to suddenly stop being violent? How long exactly? I need a deadline, you know, because it's been like, we're already in the 21st century. And if anything, this pandemic has shown us that men are too willing to subject us to violence, even under conditions where none of us have encountered a pandemic before. So I'm done waiting. I'm done waiting for men to stop being violent to us. I'm done waiting for us to think that we are better than them, bigger than them. No, I'm not. I am a human being who wants to survive and who wants to be free of patriarchy. If you want to be free of patriarchy, stop beating, stop murdering, and stop raping us. If you're not going to stop, then be ready, because it is our right. And I will conclude my answer to that by reminding people that liberation movements around the world have fought for the right to be free of colonization, of occupation, of injustice. And they have fought against colonization, for example, using anything at their disposal. Patriarchy is the oldest form of occupation, and it is our right to fight it in the same way that independence movements fought occupation and colonization. If you don't want to be fought, if you don't want us fighting you, stop beating us, stop murdering us, and stop raping us.
And one thing I wanted to ask you, and this is a little pivot from from what we're discussing now, but within the women's movement, we have to learn to take care of ourselves in a sense, and as well, because I feel like as a woman, you're fighting every day, every moment of the day. From the moment you wake up, you're putting on your armor, you're going outside, you're dealing with, maybe you're fighting that war within the home, maybe you're fighting that war just on the street. You know, however, we have so much that we have to deal with every single day, every moment of the day. And you talk also about Audre Lorde with, and she did a great phrase about self-care is revolutionary. And that seems to now sort of be becoming very commercialized and co-opted by the Goops of the world, this sort of thing. And I want to talk to you, so this is a bit of a two-part question here. I want to talk to you, one, about how do we bring that back to what Audre Lorde really was talking about? Because she really suffered, she was a Black American poet who suffered quite a lot in her life. So it really was quite revolutionary for her to talk about, okay, I got to take a moment for myself. I've got to take care of myself. But at the same time, you sort of see where the women, this movement, this sort of ideology within women, the women's movement, is being co-opted by corporations, by this, you know, let's do it, let's put on this lipstick, this is liberating eyeshadow, whatever you want to say. So, that's a bit my two-part question.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Audre Lorde is another one of my heroes, along with June Jordan. And I quote from Audre Lorde extensively in both of my books, because exactly for the reasons that you mentioned, Bronwyn. She was a Black lesbian poet who suffered tremendously, who fought very, very hard and died of cancer. And while she was waiting for a diagnosis from a biopsy, she wrote a very famous essay that everyone should read about the transformation of silence. Or about silence, basically, and transforming silence for the sake of revolution and for the sake of fighting back against patriarchy, racism, all the tentacles of patriarchy. And she said what is now a very famous line: your silence will not protect you. And that's just a reminder that if people think that by being quiet and polite and silent, when it comes to the crimes of patriarchy, that you will somehow be protected, you won't be. And this applies to women, you know, across the spectrum, whether they vote for Trump or whether they've been forced to marry or have children. Our silence will not protect us. And when she talked about self-care, I like to connect what she said about self-care with the importance also of joy, because it's not about a self-care that involves corporations or that it involves capitalism or that involves having money and going to spend it wherever. I mean, if you want to go spend your money on a massage for self-care, that's great, but I don't think that's what the revolutionary kind of potential of what Audre Lorde meant or said. I take it to mean recognize that the work that you do is a form of war, and recognize that you cannot fight for anyone if you don't care for yourself. You know how when we used to get on planes, well, I don't know when I'm next gonna get on a plane, but when we used to get on planes, they would say to us, put on your oxygen mask before you put on anyone else's oxygen mask, right? And that's kind of like the simplest recognition that unless you take care of yourself, you cannot take care of anyone else. So what I take it to mean is fight really hard, but recognize that just fighting and not stopping for a minute and taking care of what you need is going to destroy you, and you won't have anything left to give for that fight. I also take it to mean look for your comrades and your allies who can support you in this fight. Recognize that there are some days where you just say, you know what, I am taking a quiet moment, a quiet day where I'm not going to be fighting right now because I need to recharge. And also recognize that part of self-care is being very, very, what we're told is selfish. Women are always told we're selfish when we do things that patriarchy recognizes work against its interest. So my choosing to not have children is called selfish, but I recognize that that's what's going to make me free. My choosing not to do what patriarchy insists I do all the time is called selfish, because that's going to make me stronger to fight patriarchy. So always recognize that that's what Audre Lorde meant. Be selfish in a revolutionary way, because patriarchy wants to wear us out. But I also like to think that Audre Lorde meant joy and the importance of joy, because I think that for many people engaged in any kind of revolution, it's this very dour, sour, miserable thing. Like we always have to be very ascetic. We can't do what we enjoy. We can't eat what we enjoy. We can't drink what we enjoy. We can't dance. We can't listen to music because, comrade, you've got to be serious and focus on the revolution. But I'm like, this is a miserable revolution. I don't want this revolution, you know? I want a revolution to be free. I don't want a revolution to be miserable, you know? And so I join in with Audre Lorde's insistence on self-care. What Emma Goldman, the anarchist from the early decades of the 20th century, said. She was an anarchist in New York. And she very famously, people often say that she said, if I can't dance, it's not my revolution. That's not exactly what she said, but it's kind of what she said. She was at a party, she was having a very good time. And one of the men, of course, came up and said, Comrade Emma, a comrade revolutionary should not be engaging in such frivolous activity. And she said to him, comrade, whatever the fuck your name is, if this is the kind of revolution you want, that basically is just miserable all the time, then that's not my revolution, because my revolution is to be joyful and to be free. And that's what I consider self-care, to understand that we are fighting to be free, and we are fighting for a world of freedom and joy, not a world of misery, you know? So take care of yourself and always remember joy.
Okay, so we have another question from Gressa Hassa. Dear Mona, I just finished reading and discussing your book, The 7 Necessary Sins for Women and Girls, with a young LGBTQ+ audience in Albania. I was impressed by the way how you draw a line between our anger, quote unquote, or revolt, quote unquote, and what patriarchy refers to as hysteria, quote unquote, or exaggeration, quote unquote. Moreover, I really appreciate the way how you intertwine gender issues with class and racism. I am happy to listen to you live right now. I hope that in a near future, you can come to Albania so that we talk about these issues in person. Thank you. And
thank you so much. Oh my God. Okay, that was beautiful to hear. Thank you so much. I'm honored that you read my book with your class. I'm one of these days ideally wish to come. I hope I can come to Albania soon. I hope I can come to Kosovo soon. As soon as we can fly again, I will come. Bring that vaccine so I can fly. I would love to. And I'm really, really glad that she brought up it's a she, right? Who asked the question?
Yes, she's a she.
So I'm really glad that she brought up the importance of intersecting race, class, and gender, because I truly believe that the feminist revolution must be led by the queer, by the not white, and by the not rich, you know, because I want the feminist revolution to be led by those who are most suffocated by the tentacles of the octopus. And in my book, I mean, the title of my book is For Women and Girls, but in my book, I stress again and again, I'm not just talking about cis women and girls. I'm also talking about trans women. I'm also talking about non-binary people. I also want to include trans men. I want to talk about everyone who is hurt by the cisgender, heterosexual, very, very heteronormative structures that patriarchy imposes upon us and socializes us into. And this idea of hysteria and anger is really important, because in the same way that women are punished by being called selfish for doing things against patriarchy, we're also punished by the ways that we are described as being hysterical or a feminazi or a bitch or crazy or a witch or all those other things. And so at one point in my book, I say, yes, I am a bitch, I am a witch, I am a feminazi, I'm all of those things. I don't call me all of those things. The most important thing you have to know is I'm a feminist and I will be free. Because these are all these are words to use to punish us for daring to think that we deserve to be free of patriarchy. So fuck the patriarchy and stay hysterical.
Okay. So we have a comment and a question from Ilyana Banska. You are giving me life and energy in these crazy and chaotic times. Heart, love. And here is from Vyoisa Barisha. I'd love to hear your thoughts about the phenomenon of women refusing to support other women or even working against one another, rather than striving to unite and fight their common battles together, as this is quite evident in our society.
Right. Thank you so much for the kind words. I really appreciate them. God, I really wish, I miss speaking in a room where I can see everyone, where we make eye contact, we all engage in this kind of collaborative communal effort. So, but thank you all. The kind words mean a lot to me. The question about women fighting other women is really interesting to me, because there was a time in my life where I would say, I support all women and I will never fight other women. And I find my younger self now to be very naive, and I've changed. I've evolved in that position now, because I recognize that not all women are fighting patriarchy. There are some women who are happy, because again, patriarchy is not about men. Patriarchy is about a system of oppressions, and some women benefit from that system of oppressions. Even if it inevitably and invariably hurts them, they still get some benefit and some power from patriarchy. And I will not unite with those women. So I no longer say I support all women and I will work with all women and I unite with all women. No, I will fight with and I will work with a woman who wants to dismantle patriarchy. I support a woman who fights patriarchy. I will not support a woman who votes for Donald Trump. I will not support a woman who votes for a fascist party in whatever country she is in. We are not allies. So I do not support women simply by virtue of being women. And I hold the same position when it comes to politics, for example. There was a time when I would say, I want more women in politics. I will vote for any woman. That was very naive. No, I will vote for a woman who dismantles patriarchy. I will not vote for a woman who upholds patriarchy. And we've seen there are women fascist leaders. There are women fascist prime ministers. I know that in the Balkans and in Central and Eastern Europe, we've seen many female politicians who are fascist or / far right. So it's not about being women. It's about dismantling patriarchy. That's the criterion here.
Okay, so one more question has come in. From Giovanna Antoviani Almo. Fantastic talk. Thank you so much. How would you suggest to mitigate gender segregation in, for example, research?
Well, one of the most, I don't want to say puzzling, because it's actually not that puzzling, but something that we've learned over the past few weeks during this pandemic is that male researchers and male scientists are being listened to the most, are the ones who are doing the most work right now, whereas female scientists, who are often and for so long have not been given opportunities in the same way that male scientists have, are not being listened to, are not being, the TV networks don't go to them to interview them about the pandemic and their opportunities to carry out research for various reasons, including working from home, where they carry the greater burden of looking after children and looking after the family, has meant that they have less time to devote to research than men do. So in light of all of this, it's the gender segregation comes about because of patriarchy. The gender segregation comes about because of these structures that we need to destroy, whether they're in the university or in the school or in the home. And so I fight against any kind of segregation that basically upholds the tentacles of patriarchy. And we have to listen to, there's an open letter that I think 15 or 20 female scientists signed, and everything they said in that is about patriarchy. And again, it's not just about misogyny and sexism, and that's why I talk about the octopus, and that's why I say feminism is a philosophy and a movement, and not just about getting equal rights for women. Many of the signatories to that letter were female scientists of color. And so they said, not only are we held back because we are women, we are also discriminated against because we're Black, or we're discriminated against because we're women of color. So it's white supremacy, it's misogyny, it's sexism, it's ableism, ageism, all of this. So I want to break down all of those forms of segregation. Again, so I'm holding up the doll called the octopus here.
Okay. Well, let me just briefly say that Mona is doing a masterclass for us at 3 o'clock. So if you haven't signed up, you can sign up and you can get a lot more Mona, and it should be fantastic. She's hopefully going to give us even more of this greatness that we're seeing today. But we have a couple of questions. One more question coming in now from Andrita Banska, and she says, regarding to not supporting the women that are upholding the patriarchy, how do we then start the dialogue with women that uphold the patriarchy? Do you think we should even do that?
That's a good and difficult question, because of everything we talked about self-care and taking time for ourselves and being selfish with our well-being, selfish in a good way. Patriarchy would call it selfish. I would call it, being very, very careful and jealously guarding my time. It depends, honestly, because sometimes I want to devote all of my time and energies to women who are dismantling patriarchy and who need my alliance with something they're doing, who need amplification with what they're doing, who I'm working with to develop a true unity, because our goals are about dismantling patriarchy. So in the middle of all of this, and every day is a fight, like you were saying, Bronwyn, every day is a fight. In the middle of all of this, I have to ask myself, do I want to waste my time on women who continuously ally themselves with the very forces that I am fighting against? And sometimes my answer is no, I don't want to waste time on them. But then there are women in our families, there are women in our social circles who I will encounter, who then it becomes my responsibility to fight against. Because, one of the things that came up in the United States, and you will remember this, Bronwyn, when Trump was elected, a lot of people said, okay, white Americans, next time you go home for Thanksgiving, fight with your family members, because it was clear that white America was not having these very difficult conversations. And so sometimes you do have to fight with our people. So my people would be, say, members of my extended family, for example, who think that they benefit from patriarchy. I can imagine arguing with them and devoting time with them, because that family unit is my responsibility. But outside of that, honestly, I want to develop or pour my energies into something that is working and something that is going to strengthen other women. Continuously like butting my head against women who think that patriarchy benefits them, not right now. I have a lot of work to do.
Okay, well, we have a couple of questions. So the first one from Valmira Rashiti. Dear Mona, what do you think about women from the working class who keep looking down at unemployed women at a very low discriminative perspective? Do you think it's, again, that only quote unquote powerful women think that they can make a difference? Do you think it is also a fear of them seeing their own struggle within women not from the working class, a fear of not wanting to get back there?
Yes, definitely. I think, that image that I drew earlier of patriarchy throwing crumbs, I think what we also have to remember, that patriarchy makes us fight against each other for those crumbs. And so, often you'll hear women will say, oh God, I hate working with other women because whatever. I much prefer to work with men, or I prefer having a male boss than a female boss. And this is all by way of we're socialized to fight each other. And we have to recognize why we fight each other and who benefits from that fighting each other. Now, if it's a woman who is upholding patriarchy, like I said, I don't even want to waste time with her. But when we're looking at women who are hurting like this, a woman who is being strangled by patriarchy's tentacle of capitalism, and possibly of ageism, and possibly of ableism, and all the other isms that are working against her, the last person she should be fighting is a woman who has even less. And that comes from this idea of scarcity, that we are taught that the crumbs come from a cake, where it's just this limited cake, and we all fight over this one cake. And that's why I talk about crumbs. Life is not this cake. There is enough for everyone. And one of the reasons that I am an anarchist, and rather than a communist or a socialist, because I fight against hierarchies, and I don't want any hierarchy. I will destroy any hierarchy. But one of the reasons that I'm an anarchist is to get over this idea that there has to be an upper class and a working class, and more people should have more money than others. I don't believe in this at all. I believe that there is enough money, no one should be poor. There is enough food, no one should be hungry. There are enough homes and houses and apartments, no one should be homeless. So this idea that we have a working class woman looking down at a woman without work, this comes from this idea that there is a small cake that we all have to fight over. That should not be the case. I believe everyone, the world that I want us to move into when I talk about imagining a better world on the other side of the pandemic, is a world across the world where there are no borders and everyone gets a universal basic income. I don't know if this is a discussion that is happening in Kosovo, but it's happening in the United States, where everyone has the right to a universal basic income, regardless of whether you have a job or not. And there's enough money in the world to make this a reality. That way you have money to pay the rent, to buy food, and then what you do outside of that money is up to you. We should not be fighting over jobs. We should not be fighting over money, and we should not be fighting over houses. That is a capitalist game that makes us think that there's a small cake we should be fighting against. And I want to reject scarcity, and I want us to imagine abundance, because there is abundance, but it's an abundance that is held onto by a minority of people. And my feminism fights against that.
Okay, so here we have a question from Ava Chu, and she says, "Hi, Mona. Thank you so much for your work and your energy. You are my role model. I wanted to ask you about whether you still believe capital punishment for rapists would be effective to deter rape. I feel like it would just be another bat used against communities of color and underprivileged classes."
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. I oppose the death sentence for any crime, including rape. And I am learning more and more in the United States as part of the Black Lives Matter movement. I've known about it for a while from friends, Black feminist friends who've been working on this for a while, but I'm learning more about abolition of policing generally. So it would be abolition of the police, abolition of prisons, abolition of the military, abolition of any kind. So the state, one of the reasons that I have long opposed the death penalty is that the state, which I oppose, as you know, because I'm an anarchist, but the state has a monopoly on violence. And the state delegates portions of that violence that it has a monopoly over to the police, and it allows the police to be violent against us. And it delegates more portions of that violence to the so-called criminal justice system, which is then allowed to be violent towards us through things like incarceration, prisons, and the death penalty. But when you look, and this ties into the question, when you look at what that octopus called patriarchy does, that violence that the state holds a monopoly over is used the most against people who are hurt the most by the octopus called patriarchy. So in the United States, as the question makes clear, it will be people of color. When you look at incarceration in the United States, Black people and Latinx people and people of color generally are disproportionately incarcerated vis-a-vis their percentage of the population. And the same with the death penalty, and the same with the ways that the police are violent against people. So I think this is a really important moment in time where we should be questioning the violence that the state holds and why it allows the police and the so-called criminal justice system to use it against particular people. And here I will also quote the feminist psychiatrist Judith Herman, who I quote in The 7 Necessary Sins for Women and Girls. And she reminds us that the criminal justice system or the legal system was created to protect men from the power of the state, but not to protect women and children from the power of men. Now, Judith Herman is a white woman, and I'm not a white woman. So I take what Judith Herman said, which is really important, and I add to it to protect white men from the power of the state in the United States. It does not protect Black men. And then when it comes to women and children, it does not protect women and children from the state or men. And this includes, it does not protect Black women from Black men, because we have to see that there is a hierarchy of oppressions here because of the trifecta of misogyny, state, street, and home. So this is a complicated answer to the question, but I oppose the death penalty everywhere. I increasingly oppose the police everywhere. I increasingly oppose prisons and policing everywhere, because I think that fighting patriarchy will help us to fight the kind of crimes that patriarchy subjects us to. But here's something that I do say that upsets people, but that I insist on continuing to say it. I ask, how many rapists must we kill before men stop raping women? When I ask this, people think that I am saying the death penalty. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying us as individual women. If women began to kill the men who rape them, when would men stop raping us? That's a question I'm asking. So I'm not asking, because asking the state to do that is asking patriarchy with a big P to protect me from patriarchy with a small p. I want to destroy patriarchy with a big P and a small p. And that includes fighting policing, which also is spelled with a P. So it's very poetic.
Okay, I'm going to slip in here and just ask you a brief question, because I happen to know, I remember very well when you were arrested in New York for spray painting a racist sign in the subway. I can never get the image out of my head of you in that beautiful pink little trench coat with the spray paint and the red hair and doing it. And you said, I remember after that, you said that you had to spend a night in jail in New York City, and you said after that it was one of the best nights you've had, actually, that you learned so much from everyone else with you in jail. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Absolutely, yeah. I ended up spending about 22 hours in jail, first in a holding cell, and then in the central jail system of New York before I was arraigned and went before a judge and all of that. And that really was a kind of before and after moment, Bronwyn, because before that, I had never experienced any form of incarceration. I mean, I had been detained, abducted and detained by Egyptian police, but I was kept in a room in the Interior Ministry. This was in 2011, after they broke my arms and sexually assaulted me. So I was kept in a room with police for 6 hours in the Interior Ministry, and then I was taken to military intelligence headquarters, and I was kept in a room there and blindfolded and interrogated. But I was not kept with other incarcerated people and or other jail people in this instance. And this was a night spent in jail with other women who had been arrested for various reasons. And it completely shifted my understanding of truly the injustice of the so-called justice system in the United States, because there were about maybe 20, 25 women in this jail where we were kept overnight. And out of the 25, there were maybe 2 who were white. And the rest of us were either Black women or women of color like myself. And kept for what? There was one Black woman who was jailed overnight because her driver's license had expired. I mean, it was ridiculous. There was one woman who was incredibly worried because she didn't know who was looking after her daughter while she was spending the night in jail. There was one woman who was spending the night in jail without her medication, which she needed for a mental health issue. It was ridiculous, and the injustice was just writ large. It was so clear that this was racially motivated, and it just completely turned upside down the way that I look, that I began to think about incarceration and policing in the United States. So that really was the before and after moment for me. And so on Twitter, a few years after that, maybe I think very soon after that, I began to follow a Black feminist abolitionist called Miriam Kaba, who on Twitter is Prison Culture. And I've learned so much from her about the injustices of policing. And by policing, she doesn't mean just the police force or the police. She means incarceration. She means ICE, which is this kind of militia which comes and abducts people and deports them in the United States. She also means the military. And for me as an Egyptian who is very aware of the US military's imperialist, because it really is imperialist reach across the world, I want to abolish the military as well. So I've learned so much from Miriam. I've learned so much from Black feminists. And again, it's because Black feminists are positioned in that intersection of race, class, and gender to understand how damaging the police, the prison, and the military are to all those people who are strangled by the octopus called patriarchy.
Okay, so we have a question here, which I think is a great question for, as you know, the theme of this carnival is about hope. So this question from Ava Chu again is, Also, how do you find joy and nurture your hope when real equality probably won't be achieved in our lifetimes?
Yes, see that the end of that question is the really the hardest part. And I, whenever I speak about these issues, I tell people, look, I wake up every morning saying, "Fuck you, patriarchy. Today I will destroy you." Every day I wake up fully believing that I will destroy patriarchy today. But I know that patriarchy will most likely not be destroyed in my lifetime. Nonetheless, I wake up with this tenacious optimism, because I'm a tenacious optimist, that I will destroy you today, patriarchy, and I will work every single minute of that day. And that work involves hope, and that work involves joy, and that work involves knowing that I am doing what I believe in. And I get a great deal of joy just knowing that. And I get hope these days from understanding that that normal, the reason that I shaved off my hair, that normal that I stayed fuck normal to, as hard as fascist fucks as Donald Trump try, as hard as corporations try, as hard as so many people who benefited from that normal try, that normal is gone. And we are moving towards another world now. And we now can start talking, and people are listening to all the things that we long talked about that they wouldn't listen to before. So this Black-led revolution in the United States gives me so much hope, because even if you're in Kosovo or any other country where the dynamics in the United States are not the dynamics in your country, you can learn from what's happening, because this is a revolution against systemic oppression. So plug into that. It's like an energy. You can plug your veins into it and ask yourself, what does this revolution mean to me right here where I sit today? What are the systemic oppressions that I can now fight against, gaining all this power from watching? Black Lives Matter was formed in 2014 by 3 queer Black women. This is exactly what I mean about how feminism must be led by the queer and the not white and the not rich and the not famous. So that's 6 years ago, after Trayvon Martin was killed by a man called George Zimmerman. I don't know if this story is known in Kosovo, but it's yet another young, unarmed Black man who was killed because of racism. So these 3 women formed Black Lives Matter, which today has been leading this incredible revolution in the United States. People around the world are mesmerized generally by the United States because it's such a cultural hegemonic power. So when a revolution is happening in the United States, the entire world is paying attention. So pay attention to this moment of hope, because revolutions are about hope, because revolutions tell us we have the power to change things, even if not right now, because the revolution in Egypt happened in 2011 and we are still fucked in Egypt. We're still under military rule in Egypt. But look today, 9 years later, in the run up to the 10th anniversary of our revolution in Egypt, young feminists in Egypt are saying, today, the feminist revolution begins. Wow, what incredible hope, what incredible joy. And these young women who have started this hashtag, the feminist revolution begins, when the revolution happened in Egypt in 2011, they were probably 15 years old, maybe even younger. But when you grow up witnessing people rise up, you grow up with hope, because you grow up witnessing something that you will never forget. And that is the power of people to say no to authority and to power. The power of people to say, I deserve to be free. That's where my hope comes from. We deserve to be free. Look ahead to this better world where we will be free.
Okay, so unfortunately, this is our very last question. Masterclass starts at 3 o'clock. So if you haven't signed up for it, please do. But here's a question. Ada Makotsi, from Ada Makotsi, thank you. Have you considered all the consequences that derive from people taking justice in their own hands? For example, if you advocate women killing their own rapists, have you considered this escalation might lead to dead women in addition to raped women, considering they are usually physically weaker? Because if they were stronger, they wouldn't let rape happen in the first place.
Okay, I disagree with the premise of that question from beginning to end, because that question is suggesting that women have the ability to stop rape and they didn't. And that question has at its heart victim blaming that I completely reject. And second to that, it's This idea that if I ask how many rapists must we kill before men stop raping women is somehow gonna end up with lots of dead women. They're already dead women. Men are already killing women. Men are raping women and killing women right now as we speak. So they're not about to start killing women, or they're not about to start raping women when I ask this question. What this question does, so one of the people I quote in my book and in the chapter on violence is a law professor called Mary Anne Franks, who wants us to consider something she calls optimal violence. Mary Anne Franks says right now there is an imbalance of violence in society. Now remember, this is a professor of law. There is an imbalance of violence in society, and that imbalance comes from the fact that men are violent with very little consequence against women. But when a man is walking down the street and sees another man, he thinks twice before he picks a fight with this other man. And so she wants us to reach the stage where men think twice before they pick a woman to be violent against. So the onus is not on me to get men to stop raping us. They should stop raping us. I'm asking this question because I want this imbalance of violence to end in society. So I would urge the person who asked this question to reframe the question and to go to men instead and ask them, or tell them rather, stop raping women and stop being violent to women.
Okay, they're begging me to wrap this up, but I think this question is actually very interesting, and this one last question that came through. So Elena Broderson, this is for you. Can you speak to the negative impacts of the cultural appropriation of Black style and culture? I know this is an issue globally, but noticed it was an issue in Kosovo that often accompanied ignorance around Black culture.
Yes, I think that this is something that many Black activists in the US will often say. People who are not Black love Black culture and love to imitate Black culture and love to appropriate it, but they don't love Black people. And I think that this is something that we have to put front and center, because there is anti-Blackness around the world. Every country in the world has anti-Blackness. I don't know how often it happens in Kosovo, but I know it exists in Egypt, where we have an indigenous Black population, which is the Nubian population. And we also have colorism, where people with lighter skin get more social advantage than people with darker skin. So I would remind people that, again, because of this Black-led revolution in the United States, this is a really good time to ask, what are you doing to fight against anti-Blackness? What are you doing to fight against colorism? And what are you doing to fight against racism generally? Because it's all well and good to enjoy hip hop and to enjoy other forms of Black culture, jazz, whatever else, but it's not enough to just begin and end there. It is also the duty of all of us to fight all forms of racism, be they anti-Blackness or colorism.
Okay, so before they cut us off completely and bring out the hook and tell me no more, I'm gonna say, I'm gonna wrap it up a little bit here. And I just wanna say, first of all, to the audience, your questions have been, I think, fantastic. And we so appreciate your questions, your comments. Even though we're far away from each other, I feel the love through the screen. And I hope, Mona, that you feel the love through the screen.
I do, thank you.
And I hope that all of you and even more are signed up for the masterclass as well, because you'll get a lot more and you'll have more chances to ask a lot more questions. And also, finally, I want to thank Kosovo Civil Society Foundation for supporting this talk. And I also want to thank you, Mona, so much, because I think that you have been a real inspiration. As I told you before this, I've read your books. I've been following you for a long time, and you were really quite an inspiration for me in terms of my feminism and how you grew through your feminism. And I think that's something that people really should take away from this, is that you really grew into your feminism and you went through so much, and it's just shaped you in such an amazing way, and that gives me hope.
Thank you, Bronwyn. Thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure to be in conversation with you, and I thank all the people who sent questions, and I hope one of these days we will be in a hall together so that we can communicate in the ways that we usually do.
Great. Well, I'm going to let you get ready for your masterclass. And once again, thank you everyone for watching. Thank you everyone for commentating and giving questions. And hope to see you in a few minutes at the masterclass. And thank you all once again. So goodbye. See you soon.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.